Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we're going to take another look at array lists. Now, this video assumes that you have worked with arrays a little bit and also have looked at our arrays list with strings demo. If anything, we're going to be following that pattern very closely. And yes, a string is an object, but this time around, what I'd like to do is I'd like to utilize our own object. And so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to create a separate class with a very simple method in it that will allow for us to see how you can use array lists and also call methods within each individual element in that array list. And so to start off with, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create a new class. And I'm going to call this class Registrant. And so the idea here is that we're going to have maybe a kiosk set up. People are going to come by, they're going to give you their username, and you're just wanting to log that they are in a session, for instance, at a conference or an event. And the idea is this is going to be very, very simple demonstration of how we can go through and simply demonstrate that they have logged in. So we're going to keep this in our EE333 package. None of this has changed. And we just simply want to add a couple of pieces of information in here. But this time around, we're going to go ahead and make them private. The first one is going to be a username. And the type for this will be java.lang.string. And the second one will be a Boolean. And we're simply going to call this one active. And the idea here is that by making them private, that means that these variables cannot be publicly seen. And so instead, what we're going to do is we're going to have to provide some mechanism for them to be seen outside of this class, or specifically outside an instance of this class. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of methods here. One is going to be a get username, and the return type for this will again be java.lang.string. It will require no arguments. And the whole purpose of this little method here will be to return the username that is stored locally inside of the object. Again, we won't be able to get direct access to it from outside. And we can do the same thing now with our public Boolean get active or get status. And I tell you what, we're going to change this just a little bit here. How about if we word this to is active? And this will just simply return the value of the local active variable. The next thing that we want to create here will be our constructor. Remember that our constructor has to match the name of the class. And in this case, what we want to do is provide a constructor with a single argument, and we are going to pass to it the username. Now, we need to do error checking. But for this example, we're going to keep this pretty simple, and we are going to simply assign whatever value is passed to the constructor to the local username variable. I think you can quickly see that at the very least, we want to check to make sure that it is not null and that it is greater than 0 characters in length. But then we also want to go through and set the active status to false. So basically what we're doing here is we're making this the default status. And then the last two things that we want to do is create another method. This one will be also public, and we're going to have a method called setActive. And in this case, we could do two things. We could pass to it a Boolean of status, or what we can have is this be parameterless, and simply it changes the value of our active to true. And in this case, we would need no return value. And then the last thing that we want to do, and it's just a good thing to do in general, is to have a custom toString method that is, again, parameterless. We can simply build our return value from a results variable. We return the results, and effectively this just becomes a custom way for displaying the contents of our object. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to just specify the username followed by whatever this .username is and a new line. And again, active, and then simply append then whatever the value is of our active local variable, again, followed by a new line. Again, this is just meant to be a very simple little helper class that allows for us to create objects or instances of this class then that we can use in our array list. We're going to at least tidy this up a little bit. At this point, let's go ahead and build this to make sure that we have working Java code. Now, you'll note here this little warning. This just simply encourages us to add an override whenever we have our toString to identify that we are overriding this particular method. In other words, this method exists in our object class, which is the parent of all other classes. It's just a good idea to include the override whenever you are overriding a method. Build it again. Let's come back now to our fundamentals demo. And let's go ahead and set up a helper function, much like our ArrayListWithStringsDemo. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to call this ArrayListWithObjectsDemo. And again, it's going to be a public static void. There will be no return from this function. So ArrayListWithObjects. And we will also not need any information to be passed to this function. Set up our comment block, make a quick note of what we intend to do. We're going to collect information from the user, store it in an array list of objects. And specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to use our Registrant class. So to begin with, we want to set up a couple of local helper variables, much like what we saw in the earlier example with the array list with strings. As a matter of fact, you can borrow some of this if you would like to. We're going to start off with our java.util.scanner. We're going to again just call it a scanner. Going to be equal to a new java.util Scanner, and it's going to pull from system.in. This will just simply allow for us to get the usernames from the console. We want to go ahead and have a variable to store those usernames in. That will be a string. We can call it username if you would like to, or simply response. We can initialize that as empty quotes. And then what we need is we need the ability then, using our java.util.ArrayList, to store the information. And this time around, for the type of ArrayList, we're going to specify our EE333.Registrant, and we will call this variable Registrants, again with an S to indicate that it is some sort of collection. We're going to again construct it using the java.util.ArrayList constructor. We're going to specify that it needs to be an array list of EE333.Registrant. Again, this is a longhand notation. There are some shorthand notations, but until we get familiar with how this works, I encourage you to use this approach. Now, we learned from earlier that we probably want to have a continue variable that we set to true. This will just allow for us to loop through, or repeatedly rather, prompt the user for information until they get tired of using our application, or in this case are out of registrants, and then we can see what other variables we will need. So at this point then, we simply set up our while loop, and while continue equal to true, we simply pull information from the user. So collect names from the user until an exit word is entered. And so to accomplish this, we first need a prompt. And that please enter a username or exit. And then we follow this up by storing that username into the username variable, and we collect it from our scanner dot next line method. Now, again, I'm going to emphasize we are doing no validation here. We need to. But what we want to do is we want to check to see if the username equals ignore case matches our keyword of exit. And if it does, we simply set continue equal to false. And under the else branch now, we've got a couple of steps that we need to do. First thing that we need to do is to create a new registrant. The second thing that we need to do is we need to add that registrant to the registrants. Well, in order to accomplish this, what we need to do, and there is a couple of ways that we can do this, but the clearest way is to create another variable that will allow for us to hold a single registrant. And so in this case, it's going to be EE333.Registrant. We are going to call this a registrant. And if you want to emphasize this, this can be a temp registrant. That's perfectly fine if it's clear to you. And we're not going to bother to initialize it when we first declare it. Instead, we're only going to initialize it by calling the constructor rather, when we have a valid username. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say registrant is equal to new EE333.registrant. And you'll notice that unlike our earlier example where we were constructing an object of collected info, we have to specify the username in the constructor, and then that will be set and inside the constructor. Now, at this point, what we need to do is we need to add that registrant to the registrants. And so we do that by simply saying registrants.add, and then we add the registrant. And then this process will continue until the user enters in exit on the command line. At this point, then, we want to loop through the array list or the registrants, calling our toString method that we have created earlier. And to accomplish that, we're going to use the classic for loop, and we're just going to set up a index integer variable. I have a for loop that then starts off with 0, continues until we hit the size of the registrants, and then increments by 1. And at this point, what we want to do is we'll simply do a system.out.println, and we'll do this in two parts here. The first one will be the index, and then we're just going to simply indicate what the index is. And then we're going to follow this up with another print line where we will actually leverage the registrants object using the get method, and we're going to pass to it the index. So this allows for us then to print out whatever the value is for that particular registrant. Now, this looks very similar to what we've already done. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and set this up so we can get some confidence about what we're trying to do. Go ahead and build it. We're going to add it to our main as another option here. So else if args.length equal to 1. Again, we only have a single argument that we need, and that is going to be our function name fundamentally, and that is going to be array lists or array list with objects demo. And if this matches, then we simply want to call our EE333.FundamentalsDemo.ArrayListsWithObjectsDemo. At this point, let's build it again. Let's come out to our console. We can just simply change from the earlier demo strings to objects demo. And sure enough, we are again being prompted to please enter in a username. We're going to keep this simple. We're just going to add in a few and then hit exit. And you'll see that now, in addition to the username, I'm also getting the status, whether they're active or inactive, as a result of calling the toString method associated with each instance of the registrant. Now, keep in mind that each instance of that registrant has its own toString, its own local variables, values stored in those local variables. And that's the reason that why we can now have multiple names stored in this array list along with their active status. So let's make a slight improvement now to demonstrate what we can do. We've seen how to call the toString method before. Why don't we actually do something to these objects in our array list? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop through the array list, in this case, the registrants, calling a method. And we're going to do this for all. You probably would do this selectively. But in this case, we're just going to start off with 0. We're going to continue again with our registrants until we hit the size, and then increment our index by 1. And what I would like to do is I would like to call that method that I created that allows for me to set the status to active, or set active equal to true. And in order to accomplish this, I simply say registrants dot get, and I specify the index. And if I use the dot notation one more time, not only do I see the toString, but I can also see my method that allows for me to set active. Now, you probably wondered why this worked. Well, it turns out when you are calling the print line, the default method that gets called is the toString. In other words, this was implied. You could just as simply have done the same thing up here. We're going to copy and paste and then add the toString method here. In both cases, this will do the same thing. So the following does the same thing. In the case of some other function, then we will need to explicitly call it. Now, for a little bit of variety here, I would like to also show you how you can loop through the registrants using an iterator variable. So in other words, what we're going to do now is instead of a for loop, we're going to essentially use a for each. And so what we'll do is we'll set up a EE333.registrant iterator. Again, perhaps not the best variable name. You can improve on that. But we are going to iterate through our registrants, again with an S, and we are going to, for a second time, call our system.out.println, and then for each of the registrant in registrants, or another way of putting it, for every registrant in registrants, we are simply going to call our toString method. Now, again, I'm doing this time explicitly. You'll notice here that I'm specifying iterator.toString. How do we know what toString it is? Well, it's related to the type of the iterator. In this case, it's an EE333 registrant. And just to delineate between the two, I'm going to do a system.out.println, and again, either have a new line or some sort of border between the two. At this point, we should be done. We can build it. We can rerun it, and we'll enter in a couple of values. And then finally, exit. And you'll see that I am iterating through using an index. I'm actually printing it out twice. Why am I printing it out twice? Well, because I want to show that we have this implied toString here. Again, you want to be careful about using that. It's better to explicitly call toString. But then after this bar here, or after this break, you'll see that we again iterate through using a for each, but this time you'll notice that our status is active, whereas previously it is inactive. Now, a little minor detail, something to consider here when we are printing this out. You'll notice that I have appended the new line on the end of our results, and we are also using a print line here. So effectively what we're doing is we're getting an extra new line. We can decide, for instance, if we want to call system.out.print or printf at this point. It's completely up to you how you would like to be able to handle this. One other little minor thing that I'd like to point out before we leave this example is perhaps early on, while you are working first with these setters, it might not be a bad idea to put some sort of notice in the setter that something is going on. And I would highly encourage you to remove this afterwards. But what we can do here is we can actually have a system.out.print line that conveys information to the user. And it says changing active status. And you can even go a step further to include which user or username, and then we will simply append on this dot username. Now, again, I do not encourage you to leave this in your code, but rather for demonstration purposes to understand what's actually happening. I'm going to put a couple of names in again, and then follow it up with an exit. You'll see that it is actually calling the method associated with each instance of the registrant in the registrant's array list. So as always, I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.